have a very large task. We're covering a number of issues to unpack in this topic area. So thank you for being part of this conversation. At She Persisted, we've been mapping the way that gender disinformation is used as a means of authoritarian leadership, power, and control. That women are often attacked not because of necessarily the growth of gender-based violence online, but because it serves larger anti-democratic goals. It's a convenient tactic in which to make race and gender a part of a threat for women's leadership in the future of countries. So we've seen this be consistent in the way that women are attacked, no matter the country or context, around qualifications, trust, emotional control, and social acceptance. And that has the ability to affect offline voting behavior and not only drive narratives around women's leadership, but affect the choices at the ballot box. So let's start with the threats. We will go to the policy, and we will get to some communication strategy within this on the panel. Deb, let me start with you. As the storytelling lab and the work that you've done, what over the last 24 hours do you think is missing about the conversation that we've had here today? Of course, Americans, try to make too much about being the center of the world and centering everything around us. But it is a moment in which the world is pausing and looking at what happened in the US election and is searching for answers that give some sense of why did this occur, what does it mean, what are the larger trends? So let's start there.
So absolutely. So we are not the center of the universe, but something happened recently that will reverberate around the world. So we're duty bound to be a little bit more introspective about what's happened. So what's missing? I'll say the first thing is missing is that I do not want to absolve huge swaths of the women's population for their responsibility for making a choice to back a candidate who basically is a fascist. Let's just call it what it is. This person is a convicted rapist. He has no moral core. And so I understand that people have valid concerns about their quality of life, and they want to make smart decisions to increase the ability to live and thrive. But when you have the choice between fascism and not, you just have to wonder about that. And so to the degree of the large number of white women who voted for this candidate, I just don't want to absolve those women in making that choice. And I do not want to ignore the agency that they have exercised in making that choice. So let's just be really clear about that. We can protect women, but also let's call a thing, okay? Also, on the news side, I would say that what's missing from the conversation is the lack of access to credible news sources. And we've seen in many conversations this week that audiences have been sort of channeled into these sort of like siloed conversations where they can only get part of the story or not really the real story at all. And so that's going on too. And then we have just the decimation of the local news infrastructure all across the country. And so when you're at the grassroots level, at the community level, where you're in relationship with the people who gather the news for you, you don't have access to people and information that you can trust. And so at the local news initiative at the Medill School of Journalism, where I teach and run the Solutions Journalism Hub, we have research that shows that we have news outlets disappearing by multiples every month. We have a database of 9,000 outlets that we're tracking. So when you have a phrase civic information infrastructure, that reduces trust, that reduces the lifeline to credible information, the kind of information that can help you make really good decisions about your life. So that's been muted. And I was just doing some follow-up reading and having conversations post-election. And Steve Waldman, who created Report for America, and now he's working on rebuilding local news, said that we actually need 25,000 more journalists to sort of like fill that information gap. That is not a lot of people, actually. And that's a very hopeful number for me.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps we overcomplicate the problem when there's some clear, tangible solutions. Let me ask you, we were talking about, you have a long history of advocating for gender equality as an activist, as a longtime leader in this space, and now within government as a commissioner. How we bring people along to especially the younger generations and understanding that rights aren't guaranteed, that there was efforts to fight for them, and that we are required to communicate in a different way. What have you learned from some of your own family members when it relates to politicians and how we're talking about these issues?
Yeah. Before I answer that, let me just say that it's crucial that we understand that misinformation is not something new. It's been happening for ages now, and if I may give an example of what happened at the 19th century, and I will read it exactly, where the news decided to inform women that they should not ride bicycles because of their health. And they called it the bicycle phase. I don't know how many of you know about the bicycle phase, and I will read exactly what doctors said through media. Overexertion and the upright position on the wheel and the unconscious effort to maintain one's balance tend to produce a wearied and exhausted bicycle phase, usually flushed, but sometimes pale, often with lips more or less drawn and the beginning of dark shadows under the eyes. That was what the media used, the doctors through media used to stop women from getting organized, because bicycles gave them the opportunity to freedom, to travel around and organize. And I think we're facing more or less the same today. So I think it's important as policymakers, first of all, we have the responsibility to inform people of what misinformation is, freedom of expression is, where's the thin line between freedom of expression and insulting and hate speech and sexism. And just to be practical, because I like to be practical, in Cyprus what we did, we have passed a legislation in 2021 on combating sexism and online sexism. What was the problem? People are not aware of the legislation. That's the first. And the second problem is that women, because sexism and violence has been normalized, many women don't understand a few comments as sexism and violence. So today, and it's my obligation to go out, to speak with women, but most of all, to create those synergies with civil society organizations, journalists, yeah? So that we inform the wider society. And to answer the question, yes, I do have two daughters. One now, she's 14. And I'm discussing with her, and I said, you know, Eva is her name. I want to pass on this message to younger generation. Do you think they will hear me? She said, Mom, I'm sorry, but no. And I said, why? Because you're talking human rights. And younger generation are not interested in human rights. So what my daughter basically told me is that we have a huge generation gap. Mm-hmm. We are not listening to the youth. We don't know their wants and needs. And I think it's time that we go back and discuss with the younger generation. We need to find those channels, even if it's TikTok, yeah, to find the ways and discuss with younger generations.
We should utilize the tools that we have. Let's stay on the policy piece for a second. We heard from Maria Ressa yesterday about long-term, medium-term, short-term solutions that involve both people, politics, policy. So say a little bit more in the context of essentially digital monopolies that are largely US companies' ownership structures. What is it that, first of all, we can learn from a very distorted conversation around freedom of expression that has been a way in which to prevent regulation, delay it, slow it, in terms of oversight of the social media companies. So what about that freedom of expression conversation is missing context when it comes to women and how they navigate online? And what hope is there in implementing further the Digital Services Act in Europe, some of the other tools that are trying to get their hands around these unregulated multinational companies?
Well, I'm not an expert on the issue of privacy and security and technology. What I'm an expert is on gender equality. So my job is to mainstream gender through all these legislations and laws. We need to work holistically, and we cannot just ticking boxes. You know, we have the DSA. The DSA doesn't talk about sexism. It talks about hate speech. Yeah? So we need to start passing on the message to explain why it's important to talk about women's rights and gender equality and sexism through through the legislation. But I do believe that we need. Yesterday we talked about top-down and bottom-up approach. May I say a different one of approaches, the so-called sandwich approach. And the sandwich approach is that we have conventions, we have European regulations, yeah? We have the top-down, and then we have the bottom-up, which is civil society, to put that pressure into the so-called sandwich. So I'm a firm believer of policies and legislations that they do create culture, yeah? But I'm also a firm believer of the media that creates culture, but we cannot work one-on-one unless we all work together. We are going to find barriers, we will. This is the story of women's rights, facing barriers, and we're going step by step, but we should persist.
Yes. So some can take this moment in time that we're seeing. This was a year of many elections, a year also where 4 heads of state who are women were elected, in one case re-elected. Some might look at some of the developments and withdraw and self-censor and think about their agency in a different way. How can journalism, how can stories, how can different types of stories prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I just want to surface that we've already seen some of the self-censoring prior to the U.S. election. With the National Archives going back to curate some of its historical holdings to take the things that might offend some people out of their holdings. So that just drove me up a wall, because I actually wrote a travel and history book on the Civil Rights Trail in the United States. And so the idea that we would mute any part of our history that doesn't allow us to tell a truer and more authentic story, to me just, well, makes me want to pull my hair out. But from a journalistic perspective, you know, at Medill, I champion a practice called solutions journalism, and it's looking at responses to pressing social problems. And so much of the boring traditional media that young people don't want to engage with is information or stories that problematize everything. Here's a problem, here's another problem, here's a gotcha, here's your gotcha. That's kind of a big downer. Those stories are real, those stories are true, but that's not the entire story. There are people everywhere working on solutions to pressing social problems, be it access to education, community-based violence. It could be anything, right? And so very often, you know, when I'm on the streets, because I'm still a practicing journalist, I still beat the streets, people will come up and say, you people never write anything good about us. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, tell me something good about you. And so sometimes the answer is, well, I'm working with this organization and we're going to do this and we're talking about that and we thought about that. Well, that's not newsworthy. Like we can't write about intentions. But if you can tell me a story about something you're actually doing, an intervention you're actually applying, that you're testing, you don't know what's going to happen with it, but you're testing, then that is a more useful information-packed, and even potentially hopeful story, right? And so if you have all these people doing all this work and you're covering a slice of an intervention here, a slice here, and a slice here, and a slice here, you end up with a body of work of all this activity, all this work that people are doing to become agents of their own salvation, right? And so traditional journalism does not embrace that kind of framing, but increasingly journalists are. Step by step at the grassroots level, building from the ground up, but embracing a more hopeful form of journalism that is still grounded in rigor, because as we document these interventions, some of them may work, some of them might not, some of them may work partially, some of them may face challenges to scaling. You're covering the limitations to it, but studies show that when people engage with this kind of information, that they rejoice in feeling or learning about how things can work, right? And they have a greater sense of hope, and they feel like their agency has been recognized, and they have they feel like their dignity has been recognized. So I think the opportunity for us is to tell a different kind of story, or reframe the stories that we're telling, to be to interrogate our orthodoxies and change accordingly. And it doesn't have to be gender, sliced up by gender or sliced up by age. I think if we tell stories in a different sort of way, that we can get more attention, more eyeballs, and people to invest in the stories we're telling about the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. And I think we heard yesterday guerrilla storytelling, the type of stories being what we need to be aggressive about in defending women's leadership and its value to the world. We still have a distribution problem in terms of reach. The content and the type of information that is against that is reaching a larger audience that appears to be radicalized in some ways around this. What more from being in government, women who are taking positions of leadership might be more concerned about what this environment means for them in individual targeting. I also think we over-rely on resilience as a strategy, and that's not policy. It also can be sexist, asking women to just manage the problem better rather than resolve some of the problems. How have you found navigating the space in terms of the way in which you as a governmental leader are engaged in talking to society about this issue, and what lessons in the next stage of where this goes can we take from this?
I'm basically right now within the process of doing that, exactly what you just described. And I think the first step of the strategy is to create allies. Allies within media, civil society, other policymakers, the parliament, for example. And we need to have a clear target, and then go also outside to the society and inform of the problem. And if I may just connect it with what Deb just said, again, to give a practical example of how we worked when it comes to femicides. The media, the way they presented women's killings was, he killed her because he loved her. He was blinded by passion, and he killed her. So we realized that we had to work with journalists and make them understand why it's important to name the problem as it is, which takes us to the next question: who makes the news? And why we need more women in the news, and why we need more women in online platforms. And I think we need to go back a step back and see how we can create that platform that we push for more women in ICT professions. There are no women working in ICT. There are no women working in AI. So it's more a masculine structure that we need to create, if you like, a more feminine structure, because we need both women and men in every decision making. Yeah.
That example actually gives me a lot of hope, because as part of my practice, we invite storytellers, not just journalists, but all storytellers, they can embrace this practice, to look where solutions may live anywhere where they exist in the world. And so I'm sensing that moving forward, we're going to have to cast a wider net outside of U.S. borders and look to the world for more responses to these problems that we're trying to solve. So thank you for that really great example.
Yeah. We have just a few seconds left. What is a reason to be hopeful? We're talking about very serious, complex problems that require a lot of global solidarity. What's the hope in this?
Okay, so from the journalistic perspective, I'm hopeful that there's stateside, there's a lot of energy and philanthropy to funding local news. So that's one thing. Also, we have progressive governors throughout the states who are ready and willing to protect women and other marginalized groups from the onslaught of what might be coming for us from Washington, D.C. So I'm hopeful about that. And they're making some investments in local news at that level. From a personal perspective, I'm excited about community. I actually left the reception on Tuesday night to go to a Zoom call to meet with a group of multiracial women from across the country to just to start to build community so that we could bolster and fortify ourselves. And our opening prompt was, what are 4 things that are you thankful for? And then we poured it out on 2. And so I'm thankful for nature and I'm thankful for community.
Excellent.
And I will be very, very quick and say that hope, it's a word that we're hearing the last 2 days, just to remind us all that hope is coming with people. It's not something abstract. So we need to count on other women and other people in our efforts to promote gender equality and stop what's happening around the world. So, and I think, again, I'll take my responsibility as a governmental, as a government representative right now and say that it's our obligation to give spaces and voices to women. We need to create the spaces for women to raise their voices. Thank you.
Hope is a tactic and not just an emotion. And so it's the tool of also resistance. And so she will persist. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you.